Now, from river transport to road transport. And in the 1950s and 60s, British cars were as popular in Australia as they were in British colonies like India, Hong Kong and Singapore. An exhibition at the National Motor Museum in Birdwood, South Australia, celebrates the best of the post-war British cars.
When I was a kid, my dad used to take me to car museums in England. And we always used to look at these rows of English cars. So I was surprised when I came to Australia and found that for most people, post-war motoring in Australia is about Holden or Ford, or Holden and Chrysler. So when I came to set up my first exhibition at the National Motor Museum here in Birdwood in South Australia, I decided to look at the experience of British post-war motoring in Australia, and was surprised to find that until the late 1950s, British cars were the best-selling cars. Austin, Morris, BMC, they outsold Holdens right up until the late 1950s when Holden took over. And so I really wanted to look at why that was and how that affected the experience of motoring in Australia in the 40s and 50s. So I looked at the sorts of cars that people were buying, and they seemed to fall into four categories. And so I designed the exhibition around four categories, and of course the one thing that everybody knows about British motoring is the Rolls-Royce. So I had to have a Rolls-Royce, and we had one in our collection. It's the Governor-General's Rolls-Royce, and a lot of royalty have travelled in it over the years, and I felt that I'd like it in the exhibition. But I didn't want this black monolith in the middle of my exhibition. I wanted something that was a little more engaging. So I felt that one of the things that you can't do in car museums is get into the cars or see into the cars very often. So we took the doors off. I know that a lot of our female visitors really like to look inside the car and see the accommodations in the back where Princess Di would have sat, and in the front where a very small driver would have sat to drive, because there's not much room in the front. The other areas I wanted to look at were mini cars, small cars like the Morris Minor, like the Mini itself that British were famous for. And so I had a little area that looks at those small British cars. In the 1940s and 50s, British sports cars were considered amongst the best in the world, so I had to do something on sports cars, and I knew that I wanted something that was a typical classic British sports car, an upright radiator, preferably green. And again, as a kid, I'd gone to trials and seen HRG racers racing, and I wondered whether I could get an HRG, and I mentioned it to a friend, and he said, "Oh yeah, I know someone with an HRG." And this is how it often works in the museum. The friend phones me up and says I can have it for a year to put in my exhibition. And so it's there, it's great, I really love it. It's the original kit car. It's got a 1938 engine, 1939 chassis, and a body built in the 60s. One of the other areas I felt that I needed to look at was what you might think of as bank managers' cars, upper middle class motoring. And I knew that there were a lot of British manufacturers, small manufacturers like Rover, Humber, Armstrong, Siddeley, that were particularly marketing in that area. And so I wanted to look at the cars they were providing. And I got a really nice Rover for that, which I thought was the epitome of post-war middle-class motoring. The fourth area I wanted to look at was your average, everyday, normal car on the road. The sort of car that everybody could experience, that your dad or my dad might buy. And so I had a look around, and I was overwhelmed by the number that were available, and decided that rather than go with an Austin or a Morris, which I was offered several of, I would actually like to look at what Ford were doing in Britain and in Australia at that time. So I have a couple of Fords from different periods, one from the immediate post-war period, which is actually a pre-war car that's been slightly redesigned, and one from much later, a Ford Cortina Consul, which shows the way that the Americans are starting to influence British motoring and then Australian motoring immediately post-war. Of course, these cars are not simply available in Australia. They are representative of the British Empire as a whole. These are vehicles that would be seen in India, in Singapore, I lived in Singapore for 3 years, and I remember seeing many of these cars on the roads there. If you go to New Zealand, up until the 1970s, a lot of these cars were in use daily in New Zealand. Wherever the British were, until the late 1950s and the early 1960s, then their cars ruled the road. Here at Birdwood, we try to tell the story of Australian motoring as a whole. And it's a huge story. It's 100 years, 100 years of cars that have shaped the world that we live in today. There are thousands of manufacturers, thousands that have imported into Australia. So we have to have changing exhibitions, and we can't tell the whole story in one go. So what we do is we change the exhibitions around every year to tell a little niche story, and that's what this exhibition is. It's a little element of the whole story.
Coming up after the break, a husband and wife team rescue an outback pub from closing and become local heroes.